Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, I didn't know the mic was on. I didn't have to wake you up since you obviously did that yourselves, and you got here despite the rain, despite dancing until 1 at the City Hall in some cases. And we're really delighted to see you. In fact, this is one of the best turnouts for a Jerry Lee lecture, which is always challenged by being on the last day of the conference. But it won't be a challenge for you to listen to this talk by John Macdonald, who is one of the most effective advocates for rigorous evaluation research in crime policy. He came to the University of Pennsylvania from the Rand Corporation, where he had developed a pattern of working with people in other disciplines, including public health, on a wide range of innovations, really creative ways to try to fight crimes. Like, have you ever tried to fight crime with gardening and cleaning up the trash in a vacant lot? Well, I suspect we're going to hear something about that and maybe related issues. But I'm going to shut up so that you can listen to Professor John Macdonald, the chair of the Department of Criminology at the University of Pennsylvania, the first Ivy League university to create a Department of Criminology, and also director of its Jerry Lee Center of Criminology. Please welcome Professor John Macdonald.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you all. Thank you. It's really an honor and privilege to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of my work. And I just want to also acknowledge all the support and generosity that Jerry Lee's provided, not just the Stockholm Conference, but the University of Pennsylvania over the last decade. So part of what I'm going to talk about today is really trying to connect this idea of place and how we can change places to make them both safer and healthier. And so I'm going to walk you through what's kind of a short version of a longer book-length manuscript that I recently finished with my co-authors, Charles Brannis and Robert Stokes. Charles Brannis, or Charlie as I call him, is an epidemiologist, and Robert Stokes is an urban planner. So it turns out that we're thinking about more and more about changing places, their important role, in some ways trying to pave the way for a new movement, basically trying to connect urban planning and design to public health and criminology. If you think about it, the decisions in our success in life are often deeply shaped by the context in which we live, work, and play. And obviously, this is a good theme here at the Stockholm Symposium. P.O. Wickstrom's work on the context of situational action theory and place matters certainly fits into the same ideas. And so we argue that place-based programs can advance human health and safety, and in some ways this is a return to kind of 19th century ideas in urban planning around health and well-being. But what's been missing for the last couple hundred years is science. And so the idea really is to make planning decisions focus more on a scientific model and using that model of rigorous research to drive planning. So turns out that we do know this, at least from kind of correlational research, that place matters. If we think about things like electric power grids, water treatment plants, building codes, roadway safety designs, all these things in modern history have fundamentally shaped our health and safety. And some have even argued recently that maybe more lives have been saved by these kinds of innovations than innovations in pills or even policing, dare I say. Housing, parks, playgrounds, all these ideas about how we design places, though, need to rely more and more on research. So since the 1970s, there's been some growing emphasis on place designs in shaping health and safety, and this has come from a variety of fields. In urban planning, we see this around ideas around new urbanism, or in public health, what's been termed active living by design. So these are things like emphasizing mixed-use development, walkable neighborhoods, narrow street grids, think about Stockholm, where you're walking around today. It's kind of a, right, what, many modern cities are trying to do is emulate what was done in Stockholm and other European cities, but not done at the time because of an idea about science and health and safety, right? So we're trying to return to this idea. Some of the same ideas C. Ray Jeffrey talks about in his work on crime prevention through environmental design. Ron Clark, last year's recipient, in his work on as well in crime prevention, situational crime prevention. So thinking about how we can link designs to safety, but also thinking about how we can link designs to health. So new urbanism and green living are really, turns out, old ideas. So in Stockholm, there's a grid plan. In the United States, one of the original kind of cities to follow a similar plan is Savannah, Georgia. I'd encourage if any of you travel to the United States to go visit Savannah. And this idea of having parks, having a grid system, having neighborhood parks, making it more walkable, accessible. And there's been efforts in the U.S. In more recent times, like Greenbelt, Maryland is an example of a program, Garden City movement that was started in the Roosevelt administration and then abandoned, but was an early effort to try to think about, as we suburbanize places, how can we make them healthier places to live? Active living by design is a movement really in public health that we've seen in the last 15 years about just designing places to try to make people more physically active, but following some of the same principles. Crime prevention through environmental design is pretty obvious theory, right? About how can you design the physical environment to make it safer. And so here's an advert from a police department in Canada trying to encourage people to trim their hedges, right? Can you see the home? And obviously the answer is no, and if there was a burglar, you probably couldn't see them either, right? So the idea is thinking about how we design places to make them safer. So in some ways, these ideas are departures away from individual-based programs that treat a small number of people. Often we think about this for chronic diseases or probation or parole, the criminal justice system, but at the same time, often ignore the unhealthy social and physical environment where people are living. And so the argument I'm making here is that, if we make structural changes to places, these types of changes can be sustained for long periods of time. They can impact everyone in the place, not just the most affected. So this makes it politically more palpable to make changes. And they're scalable to entire populations and not just dependent on, a charismatic champion, someone who's really, a champion for a specific program. And it's often easier to change behavior when it becomes part of your normal daily routine. How many of you, for example, had a cup of coffee because it was just out there, right? If you think about convenience, and this connects to work being done in public health too, that talks about, in some ways, if you change place, you can make things the kind of default decision. Cass Sunstein in the United States was pushing this a lot at the White House in terms of issues, ideas around being able to nudge people, but just making things kind of the automatic decision. So if you think about it, changing places can make the healthy choice or the safe choice the easy choice. So, if you think about the level of effort involved, the less effort, human beings were creatures of habit and maybe fundamentally lazy in some ways. And so if we can make, those place-based decisions can kind of move up the gradient. So you can make the health impact and the safety impact can be easier if it requires a lot less effort on an individual basis. Now, obviously requires a lot of effort on, societal basis to make changes to places. So if you think about roadways, airbags, city living, all these kinds of changes we can make, they're structural, can affect people without them requiring a lot of effort on their own. But we need more science. I'm going to give you some examples here of quality scientific evidence, but we need a lot more. So I want to, encourage all of you out there to try to partner with agencies, with politicians, with people involved in city planning to think about this. So for example, in medicine, we obviously rely on the randomized controlled trial, increasingly in criminology, thanks to efforts from experimental criminologists like Professor Sherman. We can do the exact same thing for place, right? So we can randomly assign things like grass versus astroturf and see how it affects our health and our safety. So I want to walk you through some examples now where I think we gives some examples that gives us some ideas about how changing place can improve our health and safety. So it's probably not hard for me to convince most of you the inbuilt environment matters. In fact, we have a number of examples in the United States of different efforts to change the built environment, some of them not so successful. So this is just kind of this is an example of a dilapidated house in Detroit, Michigan. Detroit's infrastructure has been falling apart for the last, ever since the demise of the U.S. auto industry and the suburbanization of jobs. And this has been kind of an effort to highlight cities like Detroit and the kind of infrastructure that's falling apart, and it's called ruin porn. But the idea is to basically taking pictures of ruins as a way to kind of ironic critique. But we've seen efforts historically to redesign housing thinking about safety. So this is an advert from the New York Housing Authority saying eliminate crimes in the slums through housing. And you can see, I love this picture, by the way. You can see, right, the guy with the gun. And so this was the effort of the New York Housing Authority to encourage public housing. But sometimes good intentions have gone awry. So, this effort to build large-scale high-rise public housing has probably been one of the biggest failures in kind of urban planning in America, because you concentrate poverty. Turns out these designs aren't integrated around walking and space, or just about how cram as many people as possible into a place, often separate them from jobs and active living. So I won't go on, but here's just an example of a very famous public housing project in St. Louis, Missouri, that was built in 1959. Famous, I think, Italian architect, right? And eventually overridden with crime and demolished in the 1970s, largely because of the problems of crime and also health problems like rats and et cetera. So, the question then often comes is, well, maybe can we just should we rebuild places? Should we design them differently, or should we allow people to escape? And there's been efforts to look at, for example, providing people with options to move. But we can't just allow people to move everywhere, right? Sometimes people don't want to relocate, and if their housing options are limited, the question is, well, can they find what happens, if we provide people, citizens, with healthier homes? And so one area in public health that's really important is child health, and asthma is an example here where we actually have a randomized trial. And we can see evidence that affects asthma. So asthma afflicts millions of children around the world. Home environments are a major trigger: pests, dust, mold. And it turns out, probably not surprising to many of you, that in general, subsidized housing tends to be poorly built with cheap construction materials. And so there's some reason to suspect that subsidized housing may be kind of a recipe for kids to develop asthma. So in Seattle, they actually wanted to investigate this. So the Seattle Housing Authority partnered with their local public health agency, and they actually set up an RCT to look at what would happen when they're redesigning a public housing project, the High Point area housing project, which is a grid system with parks and so forth. But in addition, they set aside to create these homes, were called Breathe Easy homes, that are basically designed trying to improve or reduce the problems around asthma for kids. And they randomly assigned because they had more people with asthma than houses available. They randomly assigned people to get these houses, compared to a control group that received an individual-based treatment plan that they had previously done an experiment on and found some benefits. What's surprising, might surprise some of you here, is the effort just giving people a healthier home substantially improved asthma-related problems, night attacks, rescue medicine, as well as basic triggers, compared to an individual-based treatment. And these effects are statistically and practically significant. Obviously, both groups did better because both groups got some treatment. But here's an example, making it fairly easy choice. If you have a structurally built home that reduces the prevalence of asthma. So you're here as criminologists, so you don't come here to hear about asthma. So the question then, right, is what about our safety? So here, I'm going to highlight an example where we think about safety. So in Philadelphia, we have a big problem. I don't live in Philadelphia. I work in Philadelphia. We have a big problem around abandoned housing and all the kinds of health and safety problems that happen around that. So in 2011, Philadelphia passed a city ordinance called the Doors and Windows Ordinance, where they basically require property owners to install install actual windows and doors on any kind of opening in the structure. You couldn't just board up a house anymore. The block had to be occupied, though, with at least 80% of residents, so this wasn't being applied to places that are completely abandoned. And in 2015, we published an article based on a quasi-experimental analysis of this. I'm going to show you the basic picture. So here's an example of these pink notices that go up if you're in violation. It's $300 a day violation, and the owners are notified, and then in order to be compliant, they have to install a working door and window. So this is not compliant. And so what we did is we looked at this ordinance. Now, it wasn't not everyone's fully compliant with it. So we compared the changes of crime around houses that were compliant and those who are non-compliant, and controlling for kind of city location, basic demographics. This is a basic difference in differences analysis. And we also compared that to those who actually filed for a renovation permit, which means they were doing more than just being compliant. The uptake of the analysis was that there was roughly 20% relative reduction in assaults, 39% relative reduction in gun assaults, and 16% fewer nuisance, disorder, vandalism related crimes. If we take those estimates from this study and we extrapolate, it suggests there's about 490 fewer crimes a month in Philadelphia as a result of this ordinance. So if you think about that, on scale, right, a relative low-cost intervention, trying to get homeowners to invest in their homes, can generate substantial crime return. Now, this is not an experiment, right? So this is a quasi-experiment, and maybe you're concerned that the homes that were compliant were fundamentally different in some way that we couldn't measure. Thankfully, the National Institutes of Health has agreed to fund our randomized trial, where we're actually doing this now as a randomized trial. We're going to randomly assign 150 homes to be compliant by providing homeowners with basically assistance from a nonprofit corporation that will fix up their homes at a very low-cost intervention. There's some kind of model doors and windows out there that are resistant to being broken. Plexiglass that you need like a battering ram to break. But it looks nice that you can install on abandoned homes. So we're going to have 150 homes equipped like that, and then another 150 homes are going to receive a wait list, and we're going to see what happens and see if we can replicate this in a controlled experiment. And the idea would be, if we do find evidence that supports the quasi-experiment, is the city then could do things, and cities across the world could do things like set up a land bank or a trust that could then be used for when people don't have the means to actually qualify, because you can show there's a relative cost savings to providing a low-cost intervention like this. So this is just a graph showing you kind of what the expected crime rate would be and then what happens after. So what about nature cures? What about things like green space and gardens? So there is some evidence out there that we can fight crime and improve health with good greens, right? So, you know, there's plenty of epidemiological research out there, and in growing some of this in criminology as well, about the importance of things like trees and green space for our cardiovascular health, our psychological health, our respiratory health. And that all kind of makes sense, right? Produces oxygen, it's good for us. And there's some evidence growing criminology and other kind of fields about the importance of green space for reducing crime. But most of this research is correlational. You know, it compares individuals living near green, trees or green space to other areas. You know, it's clearly, there's clearly problems with selection effects here. You know, I can't extrapolate what the average Swede looks and lives like based on walking around Stockholm, right? I mean, this place is like everyone's out jogging, right? Everyone looks good, right? That's, you know, clearly not all just, that's not just Sweden, it's who comes here, right? Just like you can't draw conclusions about, you know, America by visiting Santa Monica, California. But there is growing research, and one of the more compelling kind of studies, actually, I'll tell you about, that actually got me thinking more about this possibility of the importance of trees, was a quasi-experimental study done by a geographer, actually, Ehrlich, who was a professor at the University of Delaware. And what he did is he looked at patients recovering from gallbladder surgery in a hospital in Pennsylvania. And he compared patients who had been assigned a room with a view of a tree and a garden compared to patients who were assigned from the same surgery a room with a view of a brick wall. So that's not a view, right? That's just a, I guess maybe it's a brick wall. And then what he did is he compared those patients, and there was no basis for, it was random who was assigned to what room as far as he could tell, and according to hospital policy. And he found that the patients assigned to the rooms with a view had much faster recovery from their surgeries, and it was at least suggestive about the importance of what you're looking at in terms of your recovery. And now hospitals, there are an increasing number of hospitals that are making the, you know, they call them healing gardens. And in criminology, we don't have that kind of research, but we're starting to now. In Philadelphia, we have America's oldest horticultural society that actually is involved in not just the annual flower show, but also trying to green vacant spaces in Philadelphia. And so we did a study where we took the data that they had on the lots that they were greening. So what they do is they remove trash and debris, they grade the land, and they plant basically grass. So I'll show you a picture. And it's a fairly low-cost intervention. So we wanted to look at the effect on health and safety. Oh, did I just do that? Okay, sorry. So here's an example. This is West Philadelphia neighborhood. And so in Philadelphia, in addition to abandoned housing, we have a lot of vacant land. Part of it had to do with city politics. So when there was even more abandoned housing, the city had this great idea of tearing it down. But there was no aftercare plan, right? So they tore down the houses, and then they let these lots just turn into garbage dumps, essentially, that would then, during spring and summer, get overgrown with weeds and shrubs. And so Philadelphia, PHS, the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, has this program where they'll go through and they'll change these kinds of vacant lots into these green spaces. And this is a very low-cost intervention. It's basically the cost of maintaining is the cost of paying for somebody to mow your lawn. And this grass seed, by the way, is they just spray it down. It's like the cheap seed that'll grow on anything. It's basically like weeds. So what we did is we actually compared lots that received the treatment compared to those that did not. And they were in violation, so there has to be a policy where basically the lot's overgrown, and then they can go on and clean it and green it. And we found, consistent with the work on vacant housing, we also found significant reductions in gun assaults, about 7% relative decline. We also, on the other hand, we found, which is opposite from the vacant housing, we actually found that arrests for disorderly conduct went up, which may have something to do with police response changing or neighbors calling. In terms of, you can see this here just in a graph. So if you compare the lots that receive the greening, compare those that don't, what you see is a relatively steeper decline in gun assaults. And this is, you know, a problem, particularly in cities like Philadelphia. In terms of health, we actually saw some also evidence from residents that were surveyed before and after in Philadelphia, some evidence of reduced signals of stress, and some evidence, at least in West Philadelphia, of people reporting more regular exercise. But again, that was not a randomized trial, so we can't conclusively say that the greening caused these changes, although we can say as close as you can without that. So we're actually just recently finished a randomized trial with 5 waves of, in addition to crime data, 5 waves of resident interviews. And we had 600 lots that were randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions, cleaning and greening, and maintenance, which is the basic treatment that we evaluated before, as well as kind of what we call this just a contact control. So this is just cleaning and maintenance and then control. And I can tell you preliminarily our results suggest the same kind of effects for crime, and particularly gun assaults, which is in some ways surprising because it's always hard to, you know, in general, randomized trials are going to show you smaller effects when they're done on scale than you're going to see in kind of a quasi-experiment, because, you know, you're controlling everything kind of except the treatment. So that's optimistic. We're also finding some evidence of improvements in mental health outcomes. Fear, stress, sleepless nights, things like that. So then the question then, if we can clean, we can green places, we can build better homes, what about streets? You know, what about the way that we design streets? And so here there's also some evidence I think we can point to, and it's growing as well, of the importance of street designs in transit. So this is America, presently in America, right? This is the average American life, right? Eat fast food, sit around all day, sleep, and so in America we have, you know, we have an obesity epidemic that's obviously correlated with lifestyle. I don't need a randomized trial to know that sitting around eating is going to lead to obesity, right? And so we have states where, you know, the majority of people effectively are obese in terms of, or overweight or obese. So more and more cities have been thinking about ways to address not just traffic congestion, but also things like active living. Charlotte, North Carolina is an example, and I wanted to do research on the effect of transit on health, but because of the same issues with basic selection problems, it's often difficult to know, is it the transit or is it people who select there? And so we had the opportunity to get a field study in before the transit opened in Charlotte, and look what would happen, what happens. So in Charlotte, what we did is we did a study where we sampled individuals, we surveyed them who were living around this light rail line that was going to go in, and there's 15 station stops around it, and then we surveyed them again 6 to 8 months after the system became operational, and we compared individuals then with kind of the same basic demographics, lifestyles, And we look what happened to them before and after transit opened compared to residents in the same neighborhoods who were opting not to use transit. So this is a quasi-experimental design. What we found was that taking light rail contributed, so you can see kind of pre-light rail, post-light rail. So this is the control group. What you see, the control group is gaining weight, and what you see is the treatment group is losing relative weight. As a criminologist who I don't often seek media attention, but I have to say this paper that appeared in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, I had people calling me from South America wanting interviews. Something about losing weight gets everybody excited, right? So I think crime reduction draws an audience. Weight reduction turns out is even a bigger selling ticket. And you can see the probability of obesity also reduced among users of the light rail. Now again, this is a pre-post design treatment control, and it's not an RCT. But there are other studies who have come out and who have actually done studies where they actually measure now people who are using the transit, and they find similar effects. It basically adds about a mile to a mile and a half of extra walking a day. And if you do the math, over the course of a year, and you eat the same, the average person will lose 5 to 8 pounds. So there you go. Some also work in Charlotte found also, I didn't highlight this in this talk, but there were crime reductions around the light rail development relative to future areas as well, suggesting that not only people walking and using the place more, but their safety also changed. Now, a big problem often is around roadway designs, and there are a number of people who have looked at things like cul-de-sac designs and whether or not that could help reduce crime, reduce the amount of driving through neighborhoods, giving people better guarded space. There's plenty of really good work in the UK on this. But part of the problem with all this work, again, is it tends to be correlational. People self-select where to live, what kind of to live in a neighborhood with or without cul-de-sacs. There's one good, very small-scale quasi-experimental study that was done in LA in the 1990s during the kind of peak of the violent crime epidemic in the US. Los Angeles was experiencing a lot of drive-by shootings in south central Los Angeles. The neighborhoods that were experiencing this today, you would not even recognize relative to then in terms of how they've changed. But the Los Angeles police, one weekend, or it was a couple of different weekends, after some shootings, put roadblocks on certain neighborhoods as just a way to try to reduce the traffic. And they noticed that shootings went down, just kind of an observation. So one of the captains in Los Angeles decided, hey, maybe there's something to this. He contacted the city planning department, who then also contacted an academic, California State University of Fullerton, to try to actually design and evaluate what would happen if you actually made some of these areas with really high crime and lots of shootings cul-de-sacs. And so they installed these not so pleasant barriers in neighborhoods, and some of them they actually designed with gates over them, but all an effort to kind of redirect traffic and provide limited kind of in and out access to neighborhoods. And what they did is they picked intersections and blocks that were at the peak that had the most shootings in South Central Los Angeles, and they subset basically a few of those to receive this treatment. They also assigned officers to work foot and bike patrol. The analysis, the evaluation here, what the investigator did is he looked at basically what happened before and after. And one thing I failed to mention is they removed the barriers. So you have a pre-post, pre-design here. And what you see here in this graph is cul-de-sac intervention, significant reductions in serious crime and serious assaults. And then you see that reduction go back up after the barriers are removed. and no similar effect in contiguous areas nearby. In terms of assaults, if anything, it looks like there might have been some displacement effect. You can see there. Why they removed the barriers had to do with after the riot in Los Angeles. This was highlighted in the Warren Christopher Commission report as one example of LAPD being overbearing in terms of their effort. This is, a failure to look at the evidence, unfortunately. The idea about transit, about how we design streets, these are just, there's some growing evidence, but we need more. We need more out there. We need more experiments to see what really works. All right, so how about fun? How about kids and where they play, right? Situational action theory. So there is a growing body of evidence suggesting that we can do things in entertainment districts as well as parks. And in terms of entertainment districts, some of my own work has been focusing on business improvement districts, which are growing in the United States. We have over 1,000 of them. They have them here in Europe. I'm sure there's a few in Stockholm. And essentially what it is when local merchants, businesses partner together and essentially provide some private security or sanitation to try to keep the streets cleaner and safer. They don't have actual arrest authority, but they're basically extra presence. And so here's an example from California, from Figueroa Corridor. They have what they call safety ambassadors. So this gentleman here on his bike, and then they have a clean team that goes around picking up debris and thousands of pounds of trash a month they pick up, and a safety ambassador team that's on bike and foot almost not quite 24 hours a day, but kind of at peak times every day. Comparing kind of pre-post in areas in Los Angeles that got bids compared to areas that didn't, but have similar kind of demographics and pre-existing crime. What I found in work is substantial reductions. So this is the actual, these aren't percentages, these are actual number of crimes, but what you can see is over a decline of over 25 crimes in neighborhood that got bids relative to those that didn't. And that relative reduction's on about 12%. In terms of robbery, you see about a 20% reduction, 20 to 25% reduction in robberies associated with actively designing and implementing bids. Now, what about parks, right? Often, the effort thinking, well, maybe we can make parks places as well to be more physically active. We can change them in ways to get people to use this space. Turns out, though, it's harder than it seems. Parks, and in the United States, for example, there's been efforts to build parks, and then it turns out no one's using them, or at least not on the scale that they'd hoped. But there is evidence from these kinds of studies, kind of nudge studies. If you remind people about the benefits of exercise, maybe they'll take advantage of it. So here's an example of a study that was done in the UK, comparing the use of stairs in a transit system, where they basically put a sign out reminding people to use the stairs instead of the escalator was good for them. And you can see they had independent raters go there and watch people using and count how many people were using the stairs versus escalator. And then they remove the signs, and then you see people drop off again, right? And there's a whole bunch of other studies like this. Not RCTs, but we definitely need some RCTs. So the idea of thinking about, instead of maybe pouring big sums of money into designing expensive parks, but thinking about ways that maybe you can make places more attractive through these kinds of nudges. Here's an example of another kind of nudge study done in El Paso, Texas. So it was done in English and Spanish. So, su corazón necesita or my Spanish is not that good. But anyway, it's good for your heart to walk, right? So relatively low cost design of a place. So Deborah Cohen, who's at RAND, she actually took these ideas and did an RCT. So this is the only RCT I'm aware of on parks. So 50 parks in Los Angeles, 51 were randomly assigned to receive basically, well, it was a three-armed study, but really there's two real arms. These motivational signs, another arm was basically a community group helping design what the signs and interventions were going to be, versus control condition, which is just the general park improvement. And what they found is that fairly small investment in signs, about $4,000 US, produced about a 7 to 12% increase in observed use of the park in physical activity. And control parks, in fact, found that got some upgrades saw a small decline in use. So what I've been arguing in this talk is that there are real health and safety benefits, and these are just some examples that can connect us back to ideas about how place matters in shaping health and safety. We need more. We need more rigorous research. We need more experiments. They're real in-place field, kind of community-based field experiments like we have in hotspots policing, but we need the same place with spaces. And I think that these experiments can be embedded in planning designs. Figure out what works before you actually do it, before you make a big investment in redesigning place. And structural changes to places, I've tried to argue, make long-lasting changes that are scalable and can be easily reproduced. So this doesn't require unique charisma. It requires planning, cooperation, and resources. So look, we've done really poor designs that weren't based on science for the past 60-plus years. So I think now it's time to, take evidence seriously, take experiments seriously, embed them into our planning decisions. Now, I want to finish by just noting that perhaps our desire for green spaces, connected sidewalks, social interaction is actually rooted in our basic DNA, or our heredity of the selection of habitat. So Pulitzer Prize-winning biologist Edward Wilson, professor at Harvard, noted that children around the world, not acculturated into a living environment, when shown pictures in laboratory experiments, tend to choose ecosystems that have three common features: vantage points looking down, a vista with a view of park-like with grass and scattered trees, and proximity to body of water, whether stream, pond, lake, or ocean. So these children, he hypothesizes, decisions are rooted in our ancestral history of living in savannas in Africa. Is it any wonder why people pay more, for example, to live in properties overlooking beaches, lakes, rivers, parklands? This has been one of the defining problems of mankind and her environment: the conflict between our need for economic efficiency, to live in compact, dense urban places, and our desire to live in ecologically healthy environments. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for making us think far more broadly than we're used to in criminology. And because you opened up, shall I say, new vistas of potential crime prevention, I think it'd be great, since you've allowed us enough time, to take advantage of the microphones and our very capable team here of responding to anybody who wants to put their hand up and ask Professor Macdonald a question. In this realm of urban redesign, I don't know of another criminologist in the world who is across the literature, as you've already heard. So if anybody wants to follow up, even though, to some extent here in Stockholm, this is bringing coals to Newcastle.
It is.
But as anybody who's been in developing nations, including Philadelphia, knows, there's an amazing amount of work to be done on making environments more Scandinavian. But it might also be comforting to know that with growing experimental evidence, there's a good reason why there are very low rates of crime in Scandinavia, quite apart from the fact that the people here are so nice, right? So what questions or comments do we have from the audience? I warn you, if you don't ask him something, I will. So I'd much rather hear it from you. We have somebody?
It's me.
Oh, okay.
Hi.
Oh, thank you. I thought you were one of the team. You look so ready to go.
Nearly.
Go ahead.
Yes. My name is Vânia Secato, and I am at the Department of Urban Planning and the Built Environment here in Stockholm. So it feels very close to my heart, all the things that you actually mentioned here. I think most of the things that you have mentioned, I really share the same ideas. But when I started doing some empirical research, reality actually imposed some more complex situations. And you were mentioning, for instance, the issue of parks, vistas. And I mean, sometimes a park has a positive effect. I was just mentioned this in my presentation. And as you said, it might have an effect also, a positive effect on crime. But what happens that there are many, many parks that actually are hotspots of crime?
Yeah. Now that's a challenge, right? You can imagine parks can end up, and we certainly have this in Philadelphia, you can build things on a scale that it becomes a crime attractor. And so I think that, that's a reality. I actually would think that there's trade-offs. And, this is an example where maybe, having smaller scale kind of parks, especially in disadvantaged areas, makes it more, this potential issue more manageable, and at the same time gives people more access, as opposed to, big land kind of development parks that then, can become overrun by crime. Although certainly, we could also design police-based interventions along with park creation too. So, I mean, if the land use is so desirable as an attractor for crime, that it also provides a basis for whether it's public or private kind of interventions to try to make it less desirable a place. So I think you could do both. I think though, at least in developing Philadelphia, like developing world like Philadelphia, which we have a tremendous old park system, what we're really thinking more about is these little kind of pocket parks that you can create.
And so John, in the terms of crime prevention through environmental design, a lot of the research in the 80s was suggesting cut down all the trees, cut down all the bushes, get all those sight lines, and then of course there's no green left, so not much of a park. But is it possible that if we took both ideas like smaller parks and combined them theoretically with the ideas of sight lines, that we might be able to get lower crime rates even in, for example, the allotment area near my old house in Philadelphia, where there were a number of rapes, but there were lots of concealed areas.
Right.
And you couldn't look into that allotment area and see sort of right through it, either through corridors or whatever might be going on. So there haven't been those kinds of experiments.
There haven't, and we need them. I mean, there's some correlational evidence, for example, suggesting that sight lines matter, and at the same time, like you're saying, if trees, Jeff Donovan, who I've worked with on a related study looking at, well, I won't get into the study, but it's on the emerald ash borer, but basically it's destroying trees in America and looking at its effect on crime. But his work earlier suggested a correlational study, for example, that if houses have trees that are well groomed, but covering kind of the second floor of their house, crime's lower. So it's harder to see into the house, but there's still sight lines on the road. But we need studies like that. We need studies that think about how can you do sight lines and greening at the same time.
Right, so it's not either green or no green, it's where the green is and where it isn't.
Yeah.
And that's much more precise and probably in a way easier to do randomized trials with, because you can look at smaller units of analysis and more of them.
Exactly, and you can build little, you think about a field trial, it's much easier to do because you don't need huge development money, you just need a little bit and spread it out.
So even in Stockholm, you could do these kinds of randomized trials with places. Good. Other questions or comments? Yes, in the back. Do you see the lady standing there? Yes, thank you. We'll have her on mic in just a minute. Yes, and if you could tell us what country you're from, that's helpful.
Yeah, hi, thanks very much. Yeah, so thank you very much for the talk, and I happen to be from St. Petersburg, which is Russia, and we are conducting a criminology assessment of space in St. Petersburg using a lot of
Could I just clarify, you're talking about St. Petersburg, Florida, and not
no,
Russia?
St. Petersburg, Russia, okay. No, Florida doesn't count. No.
Because we're closer to the one in Russia.
Yeah, sure, but that's a completely different case study, and that's what I'm actually trying to sort of ask about. St. Petersburg was built originally as already a planned city, and in the original plans, they already taken into account safety issues, both from fire, but also 18th century, but also from crime. So in a sense, parks were not considered in the 18th century, or all the greens actually, as a good tool to prevent any crime. But anyway, our research these days, and I have a couple of PhD students who are doing the particular analysis, tells us that the perceptions of safety are so different in different countries and in different cultures that they actually play a significant role as to how people in specific neighborhoods perceive what's safe and what is not. And so while parks, for example, in one context could be perceived, or green territories could be perceived as safe, you know, in other contexts they might not be perceived as safe. So we should introduce that variable into our research, because we sort of, when we first done our pilot, we found out that, okay, in St. Petersburg neighborhoods, you just don't have any correlation, for example, between socio-demographic data and crime. You know, single mothers don't count. In a sense, that doesn't actually, you know, serve as a predictor of crime. We also didn't have a correlation between green, etc. But also the problem of cities as St. Petersburg and many European cities, actually, that we are historic cities. And you also cannot change much. I mean, St. Petersburg is all UNESCO protected site, so you cannot build anything or rebuild anything without, you know, sort of a very, very difficult process of talking to the architectural team to how to do that. So what do we do in these situations?
Well, I think this is why you need...
That's not fairly obvious.
This is why you need low-cost randomized trials, because you should figure out, you're right, context matters. You certainly can't extrapolate from, you know, an experiment done in Philadelphia to St. Petersburg, or from Milan to Manila. But you can certainly do experiments in all those contexts and try to figure out, at least on a kind of more micro scale, what's working in St. Petersburg, and then make the case for a larger planning effort. And so I think that evidence evolves and it's context dependent. But I think that's why the field-based experimental trial is the way to go, because you can then tell people, like, we're going to get to know if this actually works here. You know?
And this is probably a good time for a non-paid commercial from the Arnold Foundation, which is committed to low-cost randomized trials in the United States. They don't want to fund things outside the U.S., but I don't think the practitioners in the U.S., city planners, for example, would be aware of the substantial opportunity to get just a little bit of funding for a randomized trial that would answer the kinds of questions that you're talking about. And in my experience, if you have a national foundation or a national governmental agency interested in testing something in a local community, that can be the tipping point for the local officials to say, okay, we'll make a special exception. We'll plant trees in this 50 areas, but not plant trees in these 50 areas, and we'll see what effect it has on assaults, even in a historic community. I mean, Savannah, Georgia, which is a beautiful place that John mentioned, also has a fair amount of violent crime. And you know, doing low-cost trials there to see if that would affect the crime rate could be very appealing to the city. But the city planners might not be able to get the approval unless they have that extra weight from the Arnold Foundation or some other outside agency. So that's the kind of trick that the Americans can have. Yeah. And
there's actually
in the European Union, I think there may also be money. So let's just one response from you on that, and then see if there's another question.
There's actually a second follow-up question which I wanted also to incorporate in the part of it. What about preserving landscapes? You know, obviously talking about changing landscape. What about preserving? Because we have the whole criminological literature on preserving preserving heritage and preserving landscape. So instead of demolishing them, because in urban planning and safety neighborhoods, you just need to do that. What you're doing, you are demolishing the whole communities and historic places, or you move, indigenous populations. So and they might not live in the conditions of trees. They might live actually in different conditions, in different built-in environments. So
in this case, the policy decision has been already made often to demolish places. And so this is just more thinking about, how can you, given the kind of conditions, how can you improve them kind of in situ, so in the actual situation where people are living, rather than actually making, so if you're going to provide if you're going to provide different subsidized housing, that's a bit about kind of fixing up what you're already making this planning decision. If you've got vacant land, what are you going to do with it? It's really more about kind of taking the actual situation in the context and then figuring out what works versus making a policy decision about, where to move people or something.
We have time for one more question. Daniel Ortega from Caracas, Venezuela, where there has been looting in the streets and all sorts of problems, will listen to any question he wants to ask.
Can parks stop looting? No, I'm just kidding.
No.
No, I was just wondering about your experimental design that you're working on and that you have preliminary results on in Philadelphia. One question is, what is sort of the optimal amount of green that you would want to invest in from a public policy perspective? Because in here you come to the issue that we often face when we think about hotspots policing, for example, on how far do the benefits displace, or whether crime displaces. Research up to now suggests that what gets spread out is the benefit and not actually crime. So in this case, you actually face exactly the same kind of question, right? How far do the benefits of this little green area extend out to? And therefore, does it make sense to have one every block? Does it make sense to have, so I wonder if your research design might be able to.
Yeah, I mean, we'll be able to, we can certainly, we're estimating very small localized effects in terms of kind of what the optimal space is. That's going to require a model, that we build, because, the experiment won't exactly answer that. Although you could certainly design an experiment that would, right, if you thought about kind of, so what we tried to do is, in this experiment, was really control as much as possible the importance of of place, in terms of the part of the city that it was in, and have treatment control places that were far enough away from each other that they wouldn't create spillovers. But I think in terms of, we'll be able to take some of those results and kind of try to model up like what kind of the overall land mass is, but I still don't think it'll be a model. We would really need, I think, an experiment to kind of figure out what the optimal design is. I mean, in some ways, what we're just relying on is in Philadelphia, for example, we have about 40,000 still vacant lots in the city. Every other, in some neighborhoods, like every other block has a vacant lot on it, right? But that's a different kind of, that's a different built environment than maybe in Caracas or other places, that have, maybe they have more of a, have less vacant lots. So I think it really is going to be context. We'd need an experiment to figure out that. But you're right, it might turn out that, the only thing I can say is that in this intervention is relatively low cost, and if it's something people want to do anyway, the crime benefit might just be kind of an additional benefit. But you're right, it might only be localized, right? And so you might need them then every other few blocks. Because there's no reason to expect that maybe cleaning this vacant lot is going to generate like huge benefits blocks away, right?
Great. So if you're interested in experimental criminology and you can get onto the American Society of Criminology website for a paltry sum, you can join the Division of Experimental Criminology and keep up with the news of what people like John Macdonald are doing. And we're very grateful to the Swedish National Council on Crime Prevention for having created the Jerry Lee Lecture in Experimental Criminology in honor of the original donor to the Stockholm Prize, who is here with us today, and I think has been at every one of these, starting with Dr. Daniel Ortega, who just asked the last question, and we're delighted he was able to join us today. I know that a lot of people have to run for some 12 o'clock events, but I suspect that if you have further questions, Professor Macdonald, would you be able to stay here and chat with some people down below? But for now, we'll say thank you very much for coming and hope to see you again next year.